and welcome to my first screencast. This is about the history of instructional theory and design. It was a pretty long chapter, but after reading through it and looking at Dr. Cantu's presentation, I wrote up a few notes. So that's what I'm going to be going over, starting with all the way back to World War II. So during that time, psychologists and educators were called upon to conduct research and develop training materials for the military. These individuals included Gagne, Briggs, Flanagan, and many others. They had a really big influence on the characteristics of the training materials that were developed. They looked a lot at instructional principles, from research and theory on instruction, learning, and human behavior. And psychologists then use their knowledge of evaluation to help assess the skills of trainees and kind of select the right individuals that would benefit from their program. And then the program instruction movement started. So this happened between the mid-50s through the mid-1960s, and it was a major factor in the development of the systems approach. So it started with B.F. Skinner's article, and in this article he kind of describes his ideas regarding the requirements for increasing human learning and the desired characteristics of beneficial instructional materials. He believed these materials should present instructions in smaller steps, require active responsive to responses to questions, provide immediate feedback, and allow for the learner to have self-pacing. Kind of with smaller steps, learners could answer all questions correctly and be positively reinforced by the feedback they received. So this was kind of more of an empirical approach to solving the educational problems. Then we have the popularization of behavioral objectives. So this occurred in the early 1960s, and Robert Mager had a lot to do with this. He wrote a book describing kind of how to write objectives that include a description of desired behaviors, the condition under which the behaviors are to be performed, and the standards or the criteria by which the behaviors are to be judged. In the 1950s, another boost in behavioral objectives occurred with the Bloom taxonomy and all of that. So the authors held that within the cognitive domain, there were various types of learning outcomes, and objectives could be classified according to the type of learner that was being observed. And so there was kind of a hierarchy relationship among the various types of outcomes. As far as the criterion reference testing movement, this kind of happened up until the 1960s, in when most tests were designed to spread out the performance of learners, resulting in some students doing well and some doing poorly. So they introduced the criterion reference testing, and that measured kind of how well an individual can perform a particular behavior or set of behaviors, and they weren't comparing it to others. So that was good. Then kind of more on the Robert Gagne, domains of learning, events of instruction, and hierarchical analysis. So in 1965, he was published describing the 5 domains or types of learning outcomes. So these included verbal information, intellectual skills, psychomotor skills, attitudes, and cognitive strengths. So each of those kind of required a different set of conditions to promote learning. So an important kind of component that I took away from that was that skills within that intellectual skills domain kind of have a relationship to each other. So this leads us to the important notion that instruction should be designed to ensure that learners acquire certain skills before they attempt to acquire those higher thinking, higher level skills. So students have to build upon their knowledge. They can't just learn how to do multiplication if they don't know how to add. So you definitely have to learn certain skills and acquire certain skills before attempting those higher skills. The Sputnik happened in 1957. So in response to the launching of the Sputnik, the US government poured millions of dollars into improving math and science education, but they didn't really test it on learners. So it didn't really work out so well, and it wasn't really effective. So this kind of um, they figured out that they need to try out drafts of instructional materials before, just going all in. So this revision process was coined as formative evaluation, um, which before they had just looked at summative evaluation. Um, then going into kind of early instructional design models. So let's start with the 1970s. So the number of instructional design models, started to increase greatly in the 1970s. Many individuals built upon the work of others. There was a lot of improvement centers. A lot of people were working on it. It was a flourishing time, not only in the world of education, but also kind of the military and business industry, and that sort of thing. In the 1980s, still remains strong, focus on education and instructional design. In public schools, there were some efforts to, improve instruction with some new textbooks. Um, they also looked at how, principles of cognitive psychology could be applied in the instructional design process and that sort of thing. In the 1990s, one trend that began was the impact on human performance. It kind of emphasized on-the-job performance rather than learning. And it emphasized more of an authentic learning tasks. And then kind of moving into the 21st century, some major influences on the field, the internet caused a huge boom. The vital role that instructional designers played in online courses. As we know now, we are all on online courses, including the public school system. So it's been a huge change. We've used a lot of online resources. We're completely online, and it's been nuts, but we're learning. Kind of increased formal learning and kind of looking at, how the traditional instructional design models might not be so useful today. It might take too long to implement, and we could be a lot more efficient. So just, you know, we've learned a lot from all of the instructional design models, and just taking bits and pieces from each of those to create where we are today. So yeah, that was kind of long. It was a long chapter. Sorry about that. But that is kind of what I took away from this chapter on the history of instructional design and theory. Have a great day.